So I just wanted to start off this meeting by saying, hiking in general and travel on the Great Divide Trail, there are some inherent dangers associated with basically spending any kind of time outside. Everything we do here at the GDTA is about providing information, reducing harm and basically giving people resources to make smart, educated decisions out there. But we really want to be sure that people are assuming their own level of liability and risk when doing so. And we're really not in the position to be taking responsibility for any kind of things that may happen to people. We're just really here to hopefully give you some information to make some educated decisions along the way. Kind of before we get started on the topics tonight, I just want to say that myself and everybody at the Great Divide Trail Association were very committed to reconciliation. And we think that that really starts by taking the opportunity to acknowledge our honor and privilege that we have by living, working, and playing within Treaty 7 territory. So we acknowledge that the GDT passes through the traditional unceded territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda, the Tsuut'ina, the Cree, Secwepemc, Late Latene, Ktunaxa, Snakes, and Métis lands. And the Great Divide Trail Association would like to invite everyone to advocate on behalf of what we can do to preserve nature for future generations. And also, we believe everybody should be educating themselves about what we can do to kind of honor Indigenous history and perspectives, so we can kind of respect the land that was stolen rather than given. Before I introduce you to the first speaker tonight, I would like to mention that this webinar is being hosted by the Great Divide Trail Association. The Great Divide Trail Association is a nonprofit organization. We're volunteer run. We have one paid employee. We maintain hundreds of kilometers of trail every year. And we really are the only advocate on behalf of the Great Divide Trail. It's the longest hiking trail in Canada. There is the Trans-Canada Trail, but that's very mixed use, but this is specifically the longest trail in Canada. And our whole goal is to seek recognition and protection, because right now it's currently not nationally recognized or protected. So we have 13 people on the board of directors and 7 committees who work all year round, all volunteer based. And to give you an idea on what we do, I think with organizations like this, sometimes it's kind of disconnected between what people see, but just for the last summer, we had 117 volunteers working on trail building. We logged 7,000 hours of trail building in those areas. We built 4 kilometers of new trail, maintained over 100 kilometers of trail, and put in 3 brand new bridges on some areas that had some kind of spicy water crossings. Another big section was through the Jackpine Valley, which was kind of one of the most feared sections on the GDT. There's quite a decent trail there now. So thank you everybody that is here tonight to learn more about the Great Divide Trail and the association. And I really appreciate everybody that donated for the webinar tonight. All of these webinars take a lot of time and effort, and they're volunteer run, and even simple things like upgrading our Zoom license for larger meetings. All these things have costs in addition to our trail building trip. So it's really appreciated for everybody that did donate, but also thank you everyone for being here. If people are interested in helping out the GDTA more, the number one way that's helpful for us is for people to become a member. Explain it better on how memberships help is we apply to so many grants and government funding. And if we have more members, we basically have more power and more influence to say, hey, listen, we have this many members, all these people are supporting us. Can you give us a grant so we can go build trails so all these people can enjoy the trail? We have 3 types of memberships. We have individual memberships, which are $30 a year, lifetime memberships, which are $100 a year, and youth memberships. So if you're 24 or under, it's actually a free membership. And these are all the companies that have partnered with us saying, hey, if you're a GDTA member, you get discounts everywhere. So there's a couple things like Gear Trade. They're a big online retailer. They have a store space too. And you get 10% off Gear Trade. If you're in the market for a new tent or a new sleeping bag or any major purchase, the cost of a membership will easily pay itself with one ticket item. Also, Durston gear, probably the #1 tent people are talking about nowadays. He just released the X-Mid 1 and 2, the Pro 1 and 2. He also gives 10% off for people. And basically all these other companies and organizations have partnered with us. So if you become a member, you get discounts at all of these places. All right, now time for the webinar. So tonight's agenda, we're going to have a topic on water crossings hosted by Josh Wiebe. He's a 2022 GDT thru-hiker. He's a water resources engineer, and he'll be sharing some information on what to expect on the GDT and tips for safely managing river crossings. After that, I'll be talking a bit about hiking through areas that have been burned, some spots that might have a lingering snowpack, and some spots that present a bit of a challenge with limited water. If you have any questions at all, we have the Q&A function going at the bottom of the chat, or at the bottom of the message there. Feel free to put your questions in there whenever you want. We'll answer every single question. Also in the chat, we will be sharing a few links for things people might want to know. I have a few links I'm going to post. Before that, briefly though, I just want to ask, we have a poll, sorry. There we go. I just have a couple questions I wanted to ask people just to understand kind of who's here tonight. It's anonymous. So the first one is, are you planning on hiking on the GDT this year? So through hike, section hike, weekend hike, day hike, or will you not be hiking on the GDT at all? All right, we'll give that another second. A few more coming in. Awesome. And I have one more. Again, there's no judgment on this at all. I would just really like to know kind of who is at the webinar here tonight. So experience, how experienced of a hiker are you? So you can interpret this however you like. All right, perfect. Thank you everyone for that. All right, and now on to Josh. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Austin. Could you hear me all right? Okay, perfect. So yeah, I hiked the GDT last summer with my spouse, and we found these webinars to be really helpful for our trip planning. So I'm happy to be able to contribute and hope that this webinar helps people during their trips this summer. The GDT was our first through hike, but every summer for the past 10 years or so, we've hiked in remote areas like Baffin Island, the Yukon, Alaska. So we felt pretty comfortable on the GDT, but it was a different style of hiking than we're used to. And one of the things we learned from hiking in the north, where there are no trails or bridges, is that you need to be able to read river features and know where to cross, when to cross, and how to do it safely. And looking online, I found that there's quite a bit of information on swiftwater techniques, but there's much less information on river features and hydrology. So I'm hoping with this webinar, we could kind of bridge some of those gaps. And you mentioned, or I'll just mention quickly that I am a water resources engineer. So when I'm out hiking, I'm always looking at what the water is doing and how the snow is melting and that sort of thing. So it's quite interesting for me. The outline for this presentation. So I thought I'd start by reviewing the types of streams on the GDT and then go through a list of the major creek and river crossings. And I thought this would be useful up front for people if they're planning a section hike or a through hike to know what to expect. After that, I'll talk about hazards, and not underestimating some of those risks. And then about half of the presentation will be about river hydraulics, river features, the best strategies for crossing. After that, I'll provide some tips for when to cross. So if you're hiking early in the season, or if there's places where there's daily fluctuations in flow, and then also what to do when it rains. And then the last point here is we'll finish with a review of swiftwater techniques. So I'll go fairly quickly through the next few slides. And what I'm hoping to do is provide an overview of the different types of streams on the GET and highlight the challenges for those different streams. So I'll start with mountain or alpine streams. So these are very common on the GDT. They have steep stream beds, interlock boulders, and the features are, sometimes known as cascades or step pools. They're usually easier crossings, but they can become difficult after it rains. And on the GDT, the larger crossings usually have a bridge. And I find the biggest challenge with these mountain streams is usually the footing. So because they're boulders, it can be quite uneven, and the rocks could be slippery. Next, we have what I'm calling cobble streams. So these are usually lower down the mountain where the valley is less steep, and the bed and banks are mostly composed of cobbles and gravel. So cobble streams are also very common on the GDT, and they tend to carry more water than mountain streams because they have many smaller streams flowing into them. I find that the footing is a little bit better. They're not as slippery, and the main challenge is usually the water velocity. So fortunately, many of these streams on the GDT are bridged. And the photo on the right here is a crossing that the GDTA put in over Cairns Creek. So that's in section D. And that was put in 2021. And there's a very neat video on YouTube showing the construction. Next, we have braided streams, and these are much less common on the GDT. They're very wide and dynamic with lots of interconnected channels. They're not bridged on the GDT and are usually not a problem unless it rains. I'd say the biggest challenge is turbidity and not being able to see how deep the water is. And that makes it really hard to choose where to cross. So one of the things you might do is just throw a rock in and listen to the sound to guess the depth. And then last on my list are meandering streams. So these are, there's only a few of these on the GDT, but you may need to cross the same river many times. And I think the Jack Pine River probably has like 10 or more crossings. So good to know how to cross properly. Meandering streams usually have a sand or gravel bed, so the footing is quite good. The challenge is that they could be quite deep in some sections. So before getting into some of the technical information, I thought it would be good or helpful to go over where the more challenging stream crossings are to help with trip planning. So if you were to hike northbound, the first crossing that might give you difficulty is near the end of section B, and that's Aldridge Creek. And for us last year, the main challenge was the number of fallen trees. So there's lots and lots of wood in the river, and just being aware of that and mitigating that risk. That stream or that creek has also shifted its course. So the trail isn't very good, and you needed to cross about 4 or 5 times. In section C, the main crossings to be aware of are Leroy Creek and Palliser River. So those are in Height of the Rockies Provincial Park. They could be an issue. There's some mention of them on the GDT trail app. So that's the Far Out or Guthook app. In section D, the House River is a wide and braided river, has lots of glacial silt. You'll find that it's much easier to walk on the floodplain than in the bush. So you'll probably be crossing the minor braids to get onto the floodplain, but you shouldn't be crossing the the main channel of the river unless it's like in September. So most of the hiking season, you just stay on the I think south shore, east shore of that river. In section E, I marked two crossings. So one is Cataract Creek and the other is Malign River. Cataract Creek could be a little bit difficult early in the season. And the bridge at Malign River system in Jasper National Park is washed out a few years ago. And that crossing is a bit tricky. There's good info on the app about where to cross and people's comments. And there's also some mention on the Great Divide Hikers Facebook group an app just about the difficulty and where the best place is to cross. All the rest are in sections F and G. So these are the more wild part of the GDT. And going through the app, there's quite a few people found Upright Creek to be quite difficult. It's quite fast flowing and there's lots of fallen trees in that area due to a forest fire. The Smoky River is likely to be the most challenging crossing for most people. It's wide and it's braided, and we'll talk about some techniques later for mitigating that risk. And there's good info on the app about where to cross. Yeah, there's a cairn section there. Carcajou and Chown Creek found could be quite flashy. So if it rains, the water could come up really fast. And we had a lot of rain the morning we crossed Chown Creek, and it was pretty dicey. It was the hardest crossing of the trip. The Jackpine River shouldn't be an issue. We'll go over some information for crossing meandering rivers. And then last is Buchanan Creek. So there's some good information on the app about crossing. It could be an issue early in the season for southbound hikers. There's a lot of Facebook discussion last year, early in the season, section hikers who are out there. So I thought here it'd be good to talk about hazards before getting into some of the other information, just so that people have this in the back of their mind. And the major hazards would be fallen trees, cascades or waterfalls, falling into the water because you slipped or the water was too deep or fast, and hypothermia. Now, with fallen trees, you always want to cross downstream, because if you were to fall in the river and get pushed into that tree, it's very difficult or impossible to get out, because the force of that moving water will hold you there. And it's quite likely that you get tangled in those branches and you could drown. So yeah, be very careful about wood in the river and cross downstream of trees. So when you get to a stream, and if it looks difficult, one thing you want to do is look up and downstream for any side trails. There's other people hike before you, and they've probably scouted and found a safer place to cross. The easiest place to cross is usually where the river is widest. And you could also use other features like gravel bars or islands or eddies to help move your way across. And I'll just finish with, like, please don't underestimate the risk of what would happen if you fell in, like, walking across a log or this or that. Take the time to look for a better place to cross, or consider waiting until the next morning to cross. So this slide is a bit of an introduction to the hydraulic features we'll be looking for in the river. And I'll have more examples in the next slide. So the figure on the bottom is a plan view of a river. So if you're looking at a map or viewing it from above, and the flow is from left to right. So when there is an obstacle like a tree or a rock in a river, the flow will go around that object, and that squeezing or constriction causes the water to accelerate. So it's like putting a nozzle on a garden hose. It's the same amount of flow in the hose, but the velocity is much faster. So when that happens, the faster moving water will erode or scour the riverbed, and that'll create a deeper area. The other interesting thing that happens when there is a or there's a recirculation current or an eddy that is behind that obstacle. Also, it might not be obvious, but the riverbed is shaped by the higher flows that occur during the spring melt and not by the lower flows when we're out hiking. So in the spring, the water is likely going to be pouring over trees and pouring over rocks. So they're quite likely that you'll find a scour hole downstream of those objects. In the drawing in the upper right, I'm showing a side view. So that would be like if you were to put your camera in the water and take a picture looking across the river. So it's a section. And the drawing shows water pouring over the rock, which creates a wave. So that's where the flow is kind of coming up and splitting, going left and right. And there's a lot of turbulence in that hole just upstream of the wave. In some cases, that could be a good place to cross. And if the water is lower, the water will flow around the rock and we'll have an eddy. So that's what's shown in that plan view drawing in the bottom. The water is moving around and there's kind of a safe resting place downstream of that rock. So I'm going to spend some time going through the river features, and I'll start with meandering rivers since they're a little bit easier to explain. So meandering rivers are usually quite wide, the current is slower, and they may be very deep along the outer bends. So in this photo of the Moose River, so this is section F, you can see that almost all of the flow is along the outer bend, and it looks pretty deep. There's also a cut bank there on that bank. And then in the foreground, you can see that the water is quite shallow and the flow is spread out. Yeah, so go to the next slide here. So with meandering rivers, the water depth and velocity depend on that planform geometry. So that's the geometry if you're to look at a map or look from above. So the water is deepest and fastest along those outer bends and shallowest and slowest along the inner bends. And that's why we have these erosion and deposition patterns. So a deep pool and a shallow bar. The straight sections are where the flow crosses over, and the depth and velocity tend to be more consistent or uniform in those straight sections. Now, the usual advice for hikers is to cross at these straight sections. But what I found is that it can be difficult to guess how deep the water is when you're standing on the riverbank. So if I think that the water may be above my knee, what I'll do is I'll walk to a point bar and then I'll cross the river on a diagonal to the opposite point bar. So rather crossing at that BB section, I'll cross on that CC path. And what this does is it gives you an easier entry and an easier exit from the river. So you don't need to struggle up a steep bank, and the water depth and velocity are more predictable along the path. It could also make for easier walking because you're spending less time pushing through the bush on the floodplain. You're walking on the gravel bar instead. And just mention, like, this isn't really anything new. Like I've seen anglers doing the exact same thing when they're out fishing. The next example is braided rivers, and these are a bit more complicated. And the biggest challenge for me tends to be the glacial silt, which makes it nearly impossible to see the riverbed, and it makes it harder to know where to cross. So some examples are the House River, Smoky River, and Chown Creek. So with braided rivers, the water depth and velocity follow similar patterns to meandering rivers. You could change the slide. The water is deeper and faster where flow converges and along bends. And one of the interesting things with braided rivers is that they usually carry a lot of bedload sediment. So wherever the flow splits, it usually becomes much shallower because the flow is no longer strong enough to move that sediment. So one of my strategies is to try to cross at the top of gravel bars where the flow splits, because it's usually shallower there. And I'll also mention that if you have the choice between crossing a single channel or a braided section of the same river, the braided section will almost always be easier to cross because the river is divided into a bunch of smaller crossings. So this is the case for Chown Creek. There used to be a bridge where the river is confined by a rock wall on both sides. The bridge was washed out. And so this location, like it's perfect for a bridge, but it's terrible to ford. So instead, what you'll need to do is go downstream where the river is wider and cross those braids. And last, I'll mention that sometimes you need to do a bit of scouting with braided rivers. Usually there's one channel that's a bit too deep. So it helps to find the location where that channel is widest or where it splits. And this may mean testing a crossing without your backpack. So take it off, cross just with yourself. And that really lowers the consequences if you do swim. So you get wet, but your pack doesn't wash away, your pack stays dry, and then you could camp and then try crossing again the next morning. So I found this photo on the internet, and I thought it did a really good job of showing what I was just talking about. So you can see that there's a shallow area that connects these two gravel bars in a bit of an arch. So it might be possible, it's hard to tell, but it might be possible to cross along here, kind of just upstream of the raft and downstream of those two boulders that are just above the raft. If you look downstream of the raft, you see that the flow is kind of coming together and converging into a narrower and deep channel. And there's a bit of a wave train downstream of the raft, and that indicates that the water there is quite deep. So yeah, it's hard to tell if this would be crossable on foot, but it looks like it might be. The next one here, so this cobble streams, and they aren't that different from what we've covered already. The main challenge tends to be the water velocity. And I really recommend looking for a wide and straight section, and that's to avoid any surprises in water depth. So this may mean some scouting. And if you look up and downstream for side trails, you might find a safer place to cross. Sometimes the main trail just spits you out where a crossing that's better suited for low flows. With cobble streams, fallen trees are fairly common. So yeah, please be aware of that. Cross downstream of any logs or trees. And sometimes you could use those logs or trees for stability if you're crossing downstream of them. So there may be an eddy created by them, or there might be some boulders that you could use that eddy behind to also break up your crossing. And this could be really effective if you're crossing with a friend. Like, you might not want to be separated too much from them. So yeah, one person crosses, midway to that eddy, waits in the eddy, their partner comes over, and they continue crossing the rest of the way. And this is my last slide for river features. So again, many of the same principles apply. But for mountain streams, you need to decide if you want to cross in the steppe, so where the water is faster and shallower, or in the pool, and that's where the water is deeper. So these two examples from the Pacific Crest Trail Association, the PCTA, they show a hiker crossing in the steppe on the left, and someone crossing, or a group of people crossing in the pool on the right. And I find there isn't a universal rule for mountain streams. Like, there's usually quite a bit of variation. So in some places, you might feel more comfortable crossing at a steppe. So if the pool is very deep, you might feel more comfortable in the steppe. Or you may feel more comfortable crossing in the pool. And that might be the case if the rocks are very slippery or uneven. I'd say that for the most part, mountain streams are only an issue after rain or late in the day if you have a lot of snow and ice melt. So that kind of leads into these next slides on hydrology and when to cross. So if you're hiking early in the season, say in June or maybe the first 2 weeks of July, the creeks will be higher and some of the crossings will be more difficult. I say that's especially in the case if you're starting in section G and hiking southbound. Early season flows are driven by snow melt runoff. So usually the ground is still frozen and all the snow that melts makes its way into the rivers. So I have two figures here from Alberta Environment and Parks. The one on the left shows the flow and water level for the Bow River at Banff. So you can see that the peak flow occurs in mid-June and then starts to subside. But higher up in the watershed where we're hiking, the peak flow is probably a few weeks after that. And then the figure on the right shows the snow pillow for a gauge in the mountains. So the x-axis is the date and the y-axis is the amount of water if you were to melt a column of snow. So we see for this location, the snow water equivalent last year peaked at around 600 millimeters. So that's 24 inches of water equivalent. And in the figure, the blue line is this year's data. So at this location, it's quite a bit lower than last year. Last year shown in red. And the gray shaded area is the normal range. So 50% of all data would fall within that gray band. For me, one of the most interesting things about the snow pillow graph is how quickly the snow melts. So even though last year was a high snow year, you could see that between about June 15th and June 30th, that snow water equivalent went from about 300 millimeters to 0. So just over, like it lost half of its snow water equivalent in just 2 weeks. And it ended up finishing within that gray band. And lastly, I'll just mention if you're hiking early in the season, you want to monitor the GDT Hikers Facebook group for trip reports. There are lots of people that go out on weekends and report back. And this is especially important if you're doing a section hike or if you're a southbound hiker. The other thing to be aware of is that for glacier-fed creeks, there could be a lot of variation in flows due to air temperature, solar radiation, and rain. So on a hot, sunny day, there'll be a lot of snow and ice that melts, and the peak flows will occur in the early evening, and the lowest flows will occur in the morning. So I have an example here from a gauge near section E. The plot here is from the end of July last summer. So this figure shows that the flow at 6 p.m. is about double the flow at 8 a.m. So this is something to consider if you're picking your campsites or deciding how early to get up in the morning if you have any significant crossings. So for sections F and G, you should probably plan to cross the Smoky River and Chown Creek before about midday, or you could camp and then cross those creeks in the morning. So this is my last slide on hydrology. And the most difficult crossings for me have always been after heavy rain. So when it rains, some of the rain is intercepted by vegetation. So it sits on the leaves and things like that. Some infiltrates into the ground, some will fill puddles and other depressions. And then what's in excess runs off into the streams and rivers. Now, the amount of water that runs off varies depending on how intense it is raining, how long it's raining, the surface characteristics. So you have more runoff from an impermeable surface like ice or rock than you would from like a soil or vegetation. And the time it takes for that peak flow to arrive at the place where you're trying to cross the river depends on the topography, so how mountainous it is, and the size of that watershed or size of that catchment. So the figure on the right is called a hydrograph, and it shows the flow with time. So that's the blue line, and the bars show rainfall over time. And the common feature in a hydrograph is that the flow increases very quickly, and then it takes quite a long time to come back down. So my advice is, if it's raining, like don't dawdle in the morning, like pack up your stuff and get moving quickly. Like, you want to get to those crossings before they become more difficult. Um, and this is more important for smaller watersheds, mountain streams, or glacier-fed streams, where this time to peak flow is much shorter. We had rain last summer when we were hiking in the Malign and Jack Pine River valleys, and I hardly noticed any difference in water level after the rain. And that's because these are much larger watersheds, and a larger portion of the watershed has a lot of vegetation. So a lot of that rain is held on the leaves and held on the grasses, and doesn't make its way into the river right away. And another tip, if it is raining, is to keep an eye out for places where you could camp if you had to. So in that case, if you get to a river and you decide you can't cross it and you're going to wait, you have some options to think about, and you're not forcing that crossing. And this is my very last slide, and it's on crossing techniques. So there's lots of information online, and I found that the PCTA website was very good. I recommend checking that one out. The photo on the right here is Austin. He's demonstrating all the proper techniques at Chown Creek. And first, for equipment, you want proper footwear. So don't try to go barefoot or in sandals. Most thru hikers are using trail runners. They dry out pretty quickly, and especially in sections F and G, there's no avoiding water and mud anyway. If you are using hiking boots, you may want a pair of river shoes, like grippy aqua socks or something like that, to keep your boots dry. For the major crossings, you'll want either 1 or 2 trekking poles or a stick to lean on. And you may find that you want to take the baskets off your poles. For some of those crossings, it just has less drag when you're putting those poles in the river. For techniques, you want 3 or 4 points of contact, never releasing more than 1 point at a time. Poles will really help with your balance and allow you to have that forward lean, and also allow you to probe the water depth. This is, I guess, maybe a little bit optional, but you'll want to look upstream where you're going. Try not to focus on the water surface. It can be helpful to move at a slight angle upstream. And what this does is it means that you're looking forward rather than kind of turning your head and body to look behind you or sideways. You definitely want to feel for a secure footing before you transfer your weight, especially if it's slippery or uneven. Move slowly and in control, bring one foot to the other. Be careful not to cross your legs. And if you do fall, you want to slip off your pack quickly. And if you can, hold on to your pack so you don't lose it. From there, you want to get into what's known as the defensive swimming position. So this has your knees up, your feet facing downstream, and use your arms to swim to shore. So just don't sit there and float downstream, like actively swim to shore. And then when you get to shore, it's important to get into dry clothes and warm up. So that's all I have for river crossings. End with that link to the PCTA website. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks a bunch for that, Josh. That was super helpful. I think a lot of times we hear about strategies on how to cross the river, but not how to read the river and where the best place to cross will be. We will post all those links here towards the end of the meeting here, link to the PCT site. And then I also have a link for the Snow Pillows site for BC and Alberta. So you can, if you are planning a trip, you can kind of see where snow levels are going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about managing snowpack along the GDT, or I guess the Rockies in general, for people that might not be specifically on the Great Divide Trail this summer. For people that maybe haven't hiked in the Rockies, to give a bit of perspective, the Rockies probably have the longest lingering snowpack in Canada, where most people are hiking. A lot of people are skiing in May. So, I mean, compare this to, say, hiking some of the American thru hiking trails where you can, enter into mountain ranges in June or even May. It's not really an option that often here. I know a bunch of buddies that are ski touring into June, especially on north facing slopes. So I just wanted to kind of put a perspective on what our hiking season looks like, and kind of what snowpack looks like. So this, I grabbed this, I think yesterday or maybe the day before. Again, this is the same website Josh was using. It's from Alberta government. And yeah, it shows snow water equivalent. So not necessarily how much snow there is, but how much water is in the snow. So many years, for the past few years, it seems like we've had crazy years one way or the other. And I know this year, just chatting with people, they're saying, oh, it's not that good of a snow year. But if we're looking at this chart here, it's pretty much dead average, right in the middle. So even though it doesn't seem like it was last year, just something to kind of keep in perspective. And I've seen on the Facebook page too, people are concerned that, oh, there's not that much snow this year. What will fires look like? But to kind of put it in long range data here, we're actually sitting kind of right in the middle. And I'll post the link to this site for BC and Alberta here just a few slides later. So for some high snowpack sections, if you're attempting a GDT thru hike, it's almost certain you're going to be hiking on snow at some point. However, there's a few sections that are a lot higher risk that may warrant a bit more of a change of plans. And I think all this is kind of part of a GDT experience. So below are pictures of Lynham Ridge. This is in section A. This is most people's second day on trail. So the picture bottom right was a picture I took 2 years ago when I was on trail. This must have been June 28th. And the picture down here in the bottom left by Nick, this was taken in July of last year. So just to show you kind of the difference here, Nick here, I don't think he must have been one of the first people going for a while here. Lynham Ridge is quite exposed. I'll talk a little bit more about it here in a bit, but this section in particular, it's a leeward slope. So what leeward means is that it's not the side that wind is coming on. So wind is coming up and over this ridge and depositing all this snow into this bowl here. And this poses a couple different hazards because it's a leeward slope, which I'll kind of get into. But with if you are kind of planning a thru hiker section A earlier in the season, Lynham Ridge can have quite a lot of snow and it can be quite dangerous. There's a high avalanche risk in this bowl. There is an alternative, which is the Rose Sage Pass alternative or alternate. And basically you start up on the ridge. One thing about that is there's not a lot of water, but if it is a higher snowpack year or there's a lingering snowpack or you're trying to start really early, usually water won't be an issue because you can melt snow. Second spot where there's usually higher snowpack is Racehorse Shoulder. This is in section B, and it'll usually be your second or third day into section B. It's the highest point on all of section B. And last year there was snow until mid to late July. And there is an alternate to get around it. It's not ideal. It's the Window Mountain Lake Equestrian Bypass. So there's a horse trail that goes around the Racehorse Shoulder there. It will involve a bit more extra kilometers. Realistically, I don't think this will be a problem this year, but just to kind of have this information out there that if there is too much snow in that area, you can bypass by going around the shoulder there. Thirdly is Numa Pass. This is on the Rockwall Trail. If people have hiked the Rockwall Trail early in the year, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're heading northbound, it's the first major pass heading out of Flow Lake. So that section's really well traveled, but again, Numa Pass, it's you're traveling up the leeward slopes. There's quite a lot of snow. Usually Parks Canada is a great place. They do a lot of maintenance on the Rockwall Trail, so you can see their trail reports on if what the trail conditions are like. Last year, Flow Lake was closed for quite a while due to deep snow. Like the entire benches were buried, but again, last year was a very big year. So if you check the Parks Canada trail reports, they'll give you a great idea on what the snowpack is looking like. And if it is too snowed in, it's really not that big of a deal for this section, because what you can do is also just kind of, instead of entering the Rockwall Trail at Flow Lake, you can just walk up the road a little bit and enter at Tumbling Creek, and you'll avoid all of that. So talking about a couple snowpack hazards, if somebody's taken an AST course or any kind of avalanche course, this might be a bit of review, but just some things to kind of chat about is, there might be sections where it might not, there might not actually be snow, but there might be cornices. That's what I'm talking about with overhead hazards. And so the picture on the right, again, is Lynham Ridge. Here across the top of the ridge, this past winter, a couple people went across it, and there were cornices the size of several school buses. And with these cornices, it's not necessarily a matter of if it'll fall, it's when it's going to fall. And here in the bottom left is kind of a better picture. This isn't on the GDT, this is in Cathedral Provincial Park, but we can see here across the top of the ridge, there's really not any snow because the wind is always traveling from right to left and depositing all this snow into the bowl. And part of that's creating this cornice. And so there will be sections where you might not see any snow, but then you'll enter an area and be like, why is there so much more snow here? Usually that means it's a leeward slope or sometimes north facing slope because there's not any sun on it. But when we are traveling in areas where there is snow, it's really important to think about, okay, what's above me and what could fall? Even if the snowpack isn't that deep, or maybe where you are, there isn't even snow, there might not be the same kind of risk of avalanche. But if we are traveling earlier in the year, some of these cornices can be the size of like large buildings. And if that's coming down at you at warp speed, it's not a very good situation to be in. Another one is post holing. I think everybody, if you haven't had the experience yet, you may, where post holing really slows you down. And if you are attempting to kind of really get out there early, I can't stress enough how much this will slow you down. If you haven't experienced this yet, maybe you will one day. It's going to cut your speed down by at least half and really bog you down a lot. So if you are going to be going out there really early, especially mid-afternoon when the snow really becomes slushy, sometimes in the morning, especially if it's freezing overnight, it can actually be a bit better because the snow will be more supportive and refreeze overnight. So something like micro spikes and ice axe can actually make travel quite a bit easier because you're on top of the snow rather than up to your knees or waist in it. But just kind of keep that in mind if you do know you'll be traveling through snow for quite a while. The last two are more related to deeper snowpack where you could be potentially in an avalanche, but that's terrain traps and exposure. So here on Lynham Ridge here, it's really hard to tell by the picture, but this is quite steep the entire way. So even if you were walking kind of just on this slushy old snow and went for a slide, you could slide for a really long way and you would really accelerate. Your speed would accelerate quite a bit as you went downhill. And there are some hazards below that you could hit, whether that's trees or small cliffs. So it's really important to think, okay, if I did fall here, what would happen? And maybe what about the alternative of sometimes what we can do is it's certainly not fun, but go, all the way down the snow and then back up. If that means, really managing a lot of risk on sliding on the snow right here. And it wouldn't be the Rockies if we didn't talk about new snowfall. So basically you can expect 12 months of snowfall in the Canadian Rockies. Even though it's not necessarily going to be the same quantities over the summer, Every month I can think back of, there's always been some kind of snowfall in the Rockies, even in July and August. And sometimes this is even at lower elevation. So for some sections, this will be totally manageable, especially if you're, at the tree line and there's good trail markers and there's more people. But where this can be quite a bit more difficult is, for example, section E would be challenging with some snowfall. So this picture here is taken from section E. There's a lot of alpine kind of cross-country travel. And there are some indications of where the trail is, but if it snows even as small as 5 to 10 centimeters, without there being trees with trail markers and kind of a natural path to follow, navigation can become quite difficult quite quickly. And also related to this is just the temperatures. Not sure where everybody's from on the webinar tonight, but weather is drastically different here than, say, starting a through hike in the States, where you're starting in California or New Mexico or Georgia. It's quite common to have below freezing nights, many nights, even in July and August. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're planning your gear. Like when you're in the Alpine, it certainly can get quite hot, but it's quite common for you to get really cold rain or snow all months of the year. And kind of moving on past snowfall is fire and water. I think it's basically inevitable that if you are going to be planning a 2-month trip in Western North America, you will encounter some kind of smoke just due to the prevalence of wildfires this year. So here's a picture in Section A in Waterton National Park. So in 2017, 38% of Waterton National Park burned. This presents a couple different hazards. Hiking the trail now, it's really hard to predict where a wildfire will be, so I don't think I can responsibly talk about that. But what I can talk about is what it's like hiking through these burns. So when I hiked the GDT a couple years ago, it was during the heat dome of June, where everyday temperatures were into the 40s, so for people in Fahrenheit, well over 100 degrees. And we can see here in the right picture, I mean, it's beautiful with the new growth of the flowers, but there is no shade to be found anywhere, and the ground is black, which really makes it hot, super hot. It feels like you're walking through a fire pit. There's really only a couple days where you're in this kind of section, and depending on how fast you go, this might be one day. But I really want to stress how hot it can get in these sections and how exposed you are, as there's really no foliage on the trees and there's no shade at all. In the bottom left here, this is the Akamina Kishinina campsite. So probably the most popular campsite for day one for people on trail. It's just it's a few kilometers out of Waterton National Park. And this whole campground burned in 2017. So in this section, there's no trees at all. So no matter what kind of weather you're having, you're very exposed. I know last year there was a big wind event, so people were really struggling to deal with the wind. The campsites there are kind of the hard packed gravel, so it can be kind of difficult to get tent stakes in. Or if it's really hot, as you can see here, a buddy brought a tarp and we were just trying to find any shade we could, because it was well into 40 degrees. We were under the bridge for a while, and then not all of us fit. So shade was a huge help. And then kind of last related to this is water carries. So there was a really unfortunate event that happened last year here. This is La Coulette Ridge, which a lot of people think is the hardest day on the GDT. Or sorry, La Coulette Peak. It's several peaks. It's not just one. So last year, there was a group of 12 people that were airlifted off of La Coulette due to heat exhaustion and dehydration. Everybody was okay, thankfully, but it's a huge bummer, because incidents like this are mostly avoidable. So this is a really important spot. This is probably the longest stretch without water on the Great Divide Trail, and it's most people's day 3 or 4. So not everybody has the same kind of trail legs under them at that point. Before you go up La Coulette Ridge, there is Scarp Campground. That's the last water for several kilometers, and there's really no alternative to kind of get off the ridge to go get other water until you just have to keep going on. It's about a 12-kilometer section, which sounds really like nothing. When we saw it on the map, I was like, 12 kilometers, we could do that in like a few hours, but most people, this takes the whole day. And this is for people that are experienced through hikers as well, not necessarily just, entry-level hikers here. So this ridge, it's very exposed, kind of on screed the whole entire way. You go up several ridges. There's a lot of elevation and, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. For most sections on the GDT, I would say 2 liters is usually sufficient. I mean, everybody's going to be different, but most people I've hiked with, they carry 2 liters as long as you fill up every single opportunity. For La Coulette, 3 liters is kind of advisable just due to the exposure. There's no shade. You're on the ridge the whole way, and there's not really an option to bail because you're going to get cliffed out either way. So it's forward or backwards. There's no side-to-side option. There's a really popular alternate called Barnaby Ridge that comes off of La Coulette Ridge. That section again, so you basically continue along the ridge. So if you're looking for kind of a higher exposure, awesome view ridge walk, it's right on up there. There's no shade, no water until you get to Grizzly Lake, which is about halfway down the ridge. Most people that I spoke to a couple of years ago were forced to go to Grizzly Lake simply due to heat and kind of exposure and being out in the sun all day. If you do plan to go to Grizzly Lake, I would advise camping there. You lose several hundred meters of elevation gain simply to get water, and then to go back up and continue down the ridge, it can really take a lot out of you. So if you do plan on doing this alternate, you will definitely need to get water at Scarp and most likely at Grizzly unless you're really moving fast. But everybody I've spoke to stayed at Grizzly just because just due to the elevation changes through there. Lastly, a section that if you're using the Guthook or Far Out app, it wasn't talked about much, but from Allison Creek to Racehorse Creek, this is pretty much at the beginning of section B. Before, we had a trail building camp at just past Window Mountain Lake, where there was a water station there where they had built a pipe from a stream to have water. This won't necessarily be there to the same extent as last year. So this kind of refill station is no longer going to be there. So there's actually quite a long stretch. It's over 10 kilometers without water. Again, it doesn't seem like that much or that long of a distance, but compared to every other section in the Rockies, where there's water every couple kilometers, it can really take people by surprise. So section B, you'll go past Window Mountain Lake. A lot of people will camp there. You'll need to fill up there because the next spot won't be for several kilometers. There are a few seasonal creeks. Last year, they dried up at the 2nd or 3rd week of July, but there was a higher snowpack. So that's just something to keep in mind, that because we are lower than last year, these creeks might be dry earlier. So just when you're reading through these notes on the Far Out app, if you are using that, just to keep in mind that, these creeks are seasonal and they will dry up, and snowpack from year to year will directly affect all of these things. And that's all I have for kind of water and snow. We'll kind of open the floor now. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and use the Q&A box down below, and we'll make sure to answer everybody's questions. Also, I'm just going to post a few links. If anybody's interested in becoming a member of the Great Divide Trail Association, it would be super appreciated. I'll post the link here in the chat box, and then I'll post the link for the PCT site for some river crossing strategies, and then the 2 sites for snow pillows, whether that's BC and Alberta. Besides that, thank you everybody for coming. Thanks a bunch, Josh, for being here. It was super helpful to have an expert on water here to talk about rivers. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, let them fly. Hazards associated with bugs. Good question. Regarding bugs, we could either talk about diseases or just annoyances. as far as I know, compared to the East Coast, things like Lyme disease aren't nearly as big of a problem. There is Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which some ticks have. Um, from my experience, there's a lot more ticks in the first couple sections. So we kind of did, like the nightly tick check in the tent. You find a buddy that's willing to look everywhere on you. And then, yeah, I mean, there's going to be mosquitoes and black flies and that kind of thing. But as far as a hazard, I'd say those are more of an annoyance rather than a hazard. Could you say more about the alternate in section D not being feasible until September? Is that every year or just this year? So the Glacier Creek or Glacier Lake alternate in section D, that's pretty much every year. The year to 2 years ago when I hiked the trail, some people I know, that was a low snow year because it was so hot. Several people got swept by the river. I was chatting with some Dan Durston, who's hiked the trail several times, and he said every single time he's looked at that alternate, it's really not feasible until September. He's been there in August. He lives near that area, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful spot. I haven't been there, but I've chatted with people that did end up going. But just that alternate and particularly is not really something that can be done anytime other than September. So for most thru hikers, that alternate isn't really feasible. And we've even chatted about taking that off of the app just because it's giving people kind of a false sense of security that it's feasible. Right. Section C should be clear in July. Really depends. I think I'm just going to include a couple links here. There's the one for the PCT. Section C, so Numa Pass coming out of Rockwall Trail, that well, that usually has snow until I'd say the 2nd or 3rd week of July, but it's quite manageable. Either it can be avoided by either just kind of walking around the snowpack, or just kind of crossing it with snowpack. Fortunately, Section C has so much traffic on it that usually there will be a pretty good trail kind of built into it. As far as I know, there's really not any major hazards in Section C for snow. Numa's the one and only, but it's very rare that people have to detour that section. Usually it's if people are going really early in the year, or it's a huge anomaly snowpack of the year. All right, just going to jump over to Q&A. Let's see what the next one is. What about river crossings on alternates on F and G? Same river crossing issues? Josh, did you take any alternates in sections F or G?
No, we stayed to the main trail there. Yeah, I'm not sure. The main ones are usually the alternates go up on a ridge, so I can't really see it being that different or getting anything that's more challenging. The tricky thing really is just rain. Like if you get rain, like any little mountain creek could become a torrent, and then you're making that decision whether to cross or to wait.
Yeah, all the sections I know of F and G are always going to be high route alternate. So you're really going up and above it, but you still have to cross the same rivers, which is going to be, when you're crossing from, one side of the valley over to the other. So I'm not aware of any alternates in F and G where you avoid the main crossings. So Dave asks, you touched on it, but what about hypothermia? Dave, did you want to expand a little bit on that, on what you mean by hypothermia? What about hypothermia? And just while you're doing that, I'm just going to respond to Patty. Has lightning ever been an issue? Yeah, lightning is quite common, especially in early July in the Rockies. You just really get that kind of mixing of weather. For most through hikers, this will be in section B. If you're kind of on the, the traditional time of when people are starting the trail, which is about June 1st, or sorry, July 1st. Usually you get quite, there's usually a pretty good heads up. If you're, below tree line, it's not as big of a risk. Not to say there's no risk, but and if you are up on alpine exposed ridges, you can see it coming and you'll hear it coming. The Rockies are pretty vast, which is nice. So you can usually see things coming down the valley compared to some other mountain ranges that are quite a bit steeper, like the Kootenays, where you have a lot less perspective on what's coming. But yeah, I know personally, we had thunderstorms for about 10 days straight. The first week of July, or the first half of July, basically we had lightning every day. How about for you, Josh? What was your lightning experience?
Yeah, we had a storm coming in near Big Shale Hill in section G. So we just had a shorter day and then a longer day after that to avoid climbing up that high point during a thunderstorm.
Mhm.
But I think that was the only, yeah, I think we only got maybe 3 or 4 days of rain out of 43. So not a lot of rain.
Jen asks, what are thoughts on river crossings for Sobo hikers starting July 20th? Josh, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I'd say it's really tricky. Like there's on the DDT Facebook group, there's a few people who live in that area and they usually get out, or last year they were getting out early and reporting conditions. Last year was unusual, but there was a lot of snow. And I was just looking at my photos and we had, I forget where we were, August 4th. I think there was still a lot of snow. Oh, yeah, we were the high point in Jasper on Skyline Trail, and there was still quite a bit of snow up there at that high point on August 4th. So, yeah, it's hard to say. July 20th, like Buchanan Creek might be a bit tricky. Jack Pine River would probably be fine. I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be fine. Yeah, it's really, I think depends on the year, depends, how quickly that snow melt happens. Like we saw where we have those snow pillow stations further in the south, like that melt happens over like a 2 or 3 week period. So I think, Austin, it's really just being flexible in your plans, which is hard to say, but being able to adapt if conditions aren't what you're planned. So maybe it's doing something else and then coming back and doing F and G later if that's the case.
I will say that's a pretty average start time for people going southbound on the Great Divide Trail. If you're starting from Kakwa, I mean, that's where most of the crossings are going to happen, is between Kakwa and Jasper. But just statistics wise, third week of July is about when most people start, just to kind of give you a better perspective on that. What are the best strategies for maneuvering on scree going both up and down? Great question. There's a couple spots where this really comes into play. So La Coulette Ridge, there's quite a bit of scree. Depending on when you go, there's usually a bit more of it. You can see where people have walked, like it's flattened out a bit. Personally, some of those sections are so steep that I just like to kind of create my own switchbacks if possible. Sometimes going straight up can just be so grueling and so steep that it feels like every step, you're just kind of losing all those steps. So pulls are a huge help. Being able to have, that one thing to be able to put it up higher and kind of leverage yourself up is a huge help. And kind of going down, I think there's two approaches. For people looking for a wild time, sometimes scree skiing can be really fun, where you kind of running where it's really loose and you kind of, really go heel heavy and just kind of like slide your feet down through it. It's definitely a huge risk of kind of losing control, but it can be quite fun. Otherwise, I'd say, pulls on scree in general are so helpful. I don't tend to switch back going downhill on scree, just because you can kind of use the loose ground to your advantage just by kind of shuffling and letting it take you down. Josh, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it kind of along the same where like if I'm going up, I'll switch back. And usually that has to do with hiking with a partner too, so that you're not sending an avalanche of scree down on someone else. So so yeah, side hilling or switchbacking is good. Um, I think for a lot of those scree slopes too, like they're right at like what's called that angle of repose. So it's usually between like 40 and 45 degrees, and the rock is locked at that angle. So it's loose, but it's also still kind of stable. So it's yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little bit more comfortable. Like if it's very angular, like I'll feel more comfortable on it than if it's more rounded material. So if it's platy or angular, you could have a little bit more confidence that it's not going to slide out on you like a bunch of marbles.
Mhm. Just there's a couple more questions in the chat. I'm just gonna get right before I jump back into the Q&A question. So what are the main reasons of people being airlifted or rescued from the GDT? So as far as I'm aware, and I chatted with everybody else on the board about the rescue, last summer was the first I've ever heard of somebody having to be rescued. And again, sure, hindsight's 2020, and I don't want to criticize them because I truly think people are trying their best and nobody wants to call for a helicopter. But in that situation, it was a really large party, so 12 people hiking together. And I think when you have a group that big, you really need to have somebody kind of taking control of group dynamics. So in a group of 12 people, there's always going to be a huge degree of abilities and kind of wants. What are people looking for in a hike? And I think in this situation, there were some people that were pretty gung-ho and they were pulling people along that either weren't comfortable kind of saying no, or they really didn't feel like that was an opportunity. So again, yeah, last summer was the only time, and it was a mix of uh, poor group dynamics, and they were unable to find the water station or the creek at Scarp campground. This year, we're going to kind of flag this. It's a few hundred meters from where people camp, and the later in the year it becomes, the further it goes. So you do have to walk, I believe it's north, but if you're if you're heading northbound and you kind of get to Scarp campground, it's on the right. And there are lots of notes on this on the app, but it's really important that that's really your last option and you need to get water there. And we had some people do some recon there in August, and it was still flowing in August. So it's a pretty dependable creek for the whole year. Someone, all right. So Dave, about hypothermia, crossing wetness, cold temperatures, miserable weather. What strategies given lightweight equipment? Ultralight means one thing, but what about tough, bushy conditions? So for crossing, one thing that I did on days where it was not that nice to cross a river is I went down just to my underwear, because then I knew I had dry clothes. So it might be really cold in the river, but at least you know you have dry clothes in your bag. Pack liner is essential for the Great Divide Trail. I had a DCF backpack, so you know it should be waterproof, but I didn't want to test it, especially at the seams. um, and yes, just having all that dry stuff there, and then even I just a little bandana. I had that just as a towel, just something to really get the beads of water off, and then just kind of moving, you'll dry off. And then yeah, like having a decent sleeping bag or quilt. A lot of it's a very hot topic in the Facebook group. I'm definitely in the camp of, go for like a 15 Fahrenheit, like a -7 to -9 bag, because you're never going to be bummed on those cold nights. Everything is nice when the weather is good, but you really find out what you like and what you don't like when the weather is bad.
I'll just add, I find that having like say like some tea bags or anything that if you are cold you could heat up some food and get some warmth in you, rather than trying to warm up with layers. So maybe carrying a little bit more fuel. I know for cold water paddling, a lot of people carry like some chicken noodle soup just to get kind of that salt in you as well. So um, yeah, that can be part of your first aid kit to carry some things like that.
Yeah, good call. I know having some food in your tummy makes you warm up a lot. Also, if you have to go to the bathroom, go. It'll warm you up so much. Having a bunch of urine in your bladder will make you feel substantially colder. Ryan asks, is Northover Ridge alternate worth it? Is the exposure rated as moderate? Northover was my favorite section on the whole Great Divide Trail. I'm actually going back to do it again this summer. It was so awesome. One thing I will say is that the lake where people camp there, so you kind of head up from I'm spacing on the lake right now, but it's in Peter Lougheed Park. You continue going up the ridge, and then you just cross over into the BC boundary where you can wild camp at the small lakes up there. That section is contentious with BC Parks. They are thinking about potentially not allowing people to camp there anymore because people have left an impact. So please, 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 if you're doing the Northover Ridge alternate, please practice leave no trace to the full extent. Do everything you can. It's such a spectacular alternate. And we want to make sure people can keep doing that. The exposure, it's really hard to say. I feel like everybody kind of has their own scale on exposure. If you scramble or if you rock climb, it's not going to be a major thing at all. But if you're used to staying with 2 feet on the ground at all times, it could be a little queasy, I guess. From what I remember, there's one spot where it's maybe 3 or 4 feet kind of straight up, where it just takes a little bit of physical ability. There's no exposure if you really fell in this one spot. So you just kind of have to get up it. And then on actual Northover Ridge, there's a section, the narrowest it probably gets is 2 feet wide, maybe 3 feet wide. And there's a section where there's really, it's a do not fall section. But I don't think it really requires a lot of skill. It's more of a head game right there where, both sides, it kind of drops straight down, but it's a couple feet wide. So it's not that you have to balance or climb to get across it. You just really have to walk without psyching yourself out too much. And then for most of the ridge afterwards, it's several feet wide and it's more of a little bit more rounded and then drops off. But I love Northover. Josh, did you do Northover?
No, we had way too much snow last year. It was even Peter Lougheed Provincial Park. Like there's still quite a bit of snow on the main trail there.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked, are mountain lions / cougars a safety risk? If so, what are suggested risk mitigation strategies? So there are definitely cougars in the Rockies. So the 2 years ago, when 2 people were attempting to set the fastest known time, he has quite a recollection of when he encountered a few cougars that night. If you're hiking in a group, you're substantially at a decreased risk. Most times from people that I've talked to that have had encounters with cougars in the Rockies, it's exclusively been at dawn, dusk, or in the middle of the night. And all these people were by themselves. Most people I've spoken to that have had encounters, they were running, and I think they were kind of at the end of their day. So they were probably running like what a wounded animal would look like by themselves in the dark. If you're in a group, I would generally say take the same precautions you would have with grizzly bears. Sound is the #1 deterrent. These animals don't want to have interactions with humans in general. A mountain lion you won't necessarily see the same way a grizzly bear is coming, but sound and just sound, size, light, those kinds of things. Also, bear spray works great too. Bear spray can be used for more than just bears. People have used it against, moose, I've heard, in other areas, or against mountain lions too. But yeah, I'd say the same precautions you would take with a grizzly bear, just or even black bear, just noise, size, and strength in numbers. Can you talk a bit more about footwear for water crossings? Are most people changing shoes every crossing, or socks if wearing trail shoes? So I'll touch on it a bit, and then I'm sure Josh has some to say on this too. So I hiked the trail and I just had trail runners the whole entire way. and I just never took them off. You know, you get to water, you just keep on walking. I brought 3 pairs of socks. So 2 pairs for hiking, 1 pair just for sleeping. And, you know, the wet pair, I just put on the outside of my bag and they dry hopefully over the day, or even if they didn't, they would probably be less wet than the pair from that day. And it's nice having trail shoes. They're light. You know, once you get a bunch of water in them, they're going to drain. And if they're waterproof shoes on the Great Divide Trail, are probably going to do you more harm. Boots, it's really hard to find non-waterproof boots, but if you're getting trail runners, I would not suggest waterproof ones, just so you can let water out. Waterproof shoes do a really good job at keeping water in, and that's a recipe for trench foot. And Josh, what did you use?
Yeah, I agree with you. I used 2 different trail runners. Yeah, a Topo one and then a Brooks one after. And yeah, I really like the Topo one. It held up better and yeah, it was just a better shoe. But yeah, just trail runners, 2 pairs of socks, and there's so many sections that are like muddy and just wet. There's no way of getting around that. You know, you might try to keep your shoes clean and then just give up later. So yeah, I don't think it makes sense to carry a second pair of shoes for river crossings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will say, I would not try to have 1 pair of shoes if you're doing a through hike last the whole trail. I went through 3 pairs of shoes. Some people I know went through 2, but at least 2 pairs of shoes. And most people, if you're just going to do 2 pairs of shoes, most people are going to swap at probably around Lake Louise. Are there any campsites, particularly in Waterton, you'd avoid due to dead trees? I can't think of anywhere. I'm assuming that you mean that there's like a risk of trees falling down because they're dead. So the Akamina Kishinina campsite, there are a lot of dead trees, but Parks Canada took a very conservative approach and cut down any of them that could possibly fall on people. This also happened in Section C, MacArthur Creek, which is just north of the Rockwall Trail before you get into Field. There was a huge wind event that sent like hundreds of trees down. Apparently it looked like if you emptied out a box of matches on the ground, that's what all the trees looked like. And so Parks Canada took the initiative and just, cut down a ton of trees around the campground. So there's a really much lower risk of trees falling on you. With the Akamina campground, I mean, it's in a good spot to camp. So it's hard to avoid that one. And I mean, it's clean. There's bear lockers. There's water right there with a bridge. You can wash yourself. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily avoid it because of the dead trees. It can just get quite hot. Could you suggest alternatives for exiting Kakwa Lake, going Nobo this year, seeing Robson Valley's not operating this year? Yeah, so there's a couple options for this. Coming out at Kakwa seems to be quite difficult this year with kind of the road condition, and Robson Valley's not doing this. So there's a couple things. There have been over a dozen people that have asked us about a helicopter exit from Kakwa Lake. So that is something that can happen. We're going to try and see if we can organize like a group finish date. So if people are interested in getting a heli lift out of Kakwa Lake, people could pool together and all get in the same helicopter and save a ton of money rather than chartering your own. Kakwa Lake does have a hut there. So even if that meant, hanging out one extra day, it's a spectacular finish. It's a beautiful hut on a beautiful lake. If you did have to hang out there another day, it would not be a bad time at all. Another option, if that really doesn't interest you or it doesn't work, is hiking back to Blueberry. So we're going to try to see, there's potentially an operator that's going to be working out of the Blueberry campground. So Blueberry's before Kakwa, so south of Kakwa. And it's pretty quick to access the Forest Service Road there. And we're working on seeing if there's an operator that's willing to do shuttled rides out of there. Again, with this, one of the reasons, speaking with Robson Valley Adventures, is they said that plans changed so much, so it was really hard for them to plan out their summer when, a hiker might be like, oh, I'm a day late, I'm a day early, I'm getting a ride with a friend actually. So both of these situations would be, this is when the ride or the flight is leaving. Um, make your schedule work because this is when it's leaving. So we'll see in the future, the Walker Creek Forest Service Road will become more active. So we will kind of potentially see how this will change in the future. But for the time being, exiting at Blueberry. So that would mean either backtracking or not going all the way to Kakwa, depending on how you feel, or getting a flight out of there if you don't have somebody to come drive and pick you up. Mary in the chat says 2 people were airlifted off Lac last year. Okay, I wasn't aware of this. The other member hopped on, was exhausted. Yeah, it's a really, really hard day. I was hiking with people that were triple crowners and they were exhausted after Lac Peak. Dave asked, any issue with waterborne illness? Josh, what did you do for water treatment on the GDT?
Yeah, we had 2 treatment methods. So we had like I forget what it's called, life straw for like on trail. And then we have this older MSR device called a Myox. They don't make them anymore, but yeah, we'd use that for water treatment at camp. It's about the size of a highlighter and creates what's called a mixed oxidant. So it's like a chemical treatment. So we didn't have any issues, but for other trips I've been on, like group trips, people usually get sick because one member of the group isn't really washing their hands properly after going to the bathroom. So that I'd say is probably something more to be aware of is washing your hands, getting under your fingernails so you're not making yourself sick.
Yeah, it's so tempting to drink without water treatment on the Great Divide Trail when you see it melting out of a glacier. It's like, oh, I just really want the purest of water. But it's 100% avoidable, maybe not 100%, but highly avoidable. So I also use 2 treatment. I used a Sawyer squeeze for pretty much all the time. And then I brought some of like the tablets, I don't know, they're chlorine or something, but and that was nice for camp. So then, you're making food. I was hiking with my partner, so it was we were frequently boiling like 1 to 1.2 liters of water. And it's nice to just, have one bottle and just right when you show up to camp, fill it up, put one of the tabs in there, give it 30 minutes while you set up your tent and everything. But yeah, in general though, I'd say the Great Divide Trail has exceptionally good water. There's very few spots where the water has like, visible problems with it, like hearing people that hike the Arizona Trail or even the desert of the PCT where water is lingering for months without being touched. Most of the water on all of the GDT is moving quite quickly, so it can stay clean. One thing I will mention real quick is we talk about rock flour. This is more prevalent in like sections D and E and north of there. If it looks kind of like Kool-Aid and you can't see through it and it's just kind of that chalky color, it's really nice having the chlorine pills because that stuff will clog up your filter, especially if you have a filter like a Sawyer, so quickly. And not everybody's bringing the back flush tool, and it can kind of, really plug up a filter and make it unusable after just a couple liters. So I always kept a couple of those chlorine tabs in like our first aid kit. And then in each resupply, we had maybe 5 or 10. They weigh like, I don't know, hardly anything for the benefit of those times you see water that it's like, well, this is really going to clog up my filter. How would you recommend resupplying around Blueberry? Is getting someone to leave a hang feasible? Yeah, so this year at the Great Divide Trail Association, we're really working hard to potentially get some bear lockers at Blueberry. So what's happened in the past is Robson Valley Adventures, and I'm under the impression that they are willing to do resupplies again this year for Blueberry. I'll have to double check. It'll definitely be on the Facebook page. I just can't remember off the top of my head. But what they were doing is they were leaving it either in a hang or an ursack, leaving it for people. One thing I will mention is that last year there was a lot of food that was left there from people that, bailed because they got hurt or, they didn't need the food or something, but there was a lot left there. And BC Parks was not happy with us at all, which makes sense. I mean, it's litter. If you're leaving something there, it doesn't matter what it is, and you don't have any intention to go get it, it's litter. So we are working on trying to get some lockers installed. The more GDT members we have, the better it looks, because we can show, these people are hiking the trail. Let's get some lockers in there. And this is just, going to be basically a better way to manage this. Another thing, it happened 2 years ago, is we got or I guess a year ago, we got lockers at Peter Lougheed Park. So that's the end of section B. Before that, there was a little tiny camp store. Otherwise, you needed a friend to drive into Kananaskis and drop off your food. But now we have bear lockers there. And if people are interested, Nicole Sharp does a resupply there. So you can mail food to her, and then she'll take it to the bear lockers in the park. And there's a code to get your food there. If you are a GDT member, she does give you a discount. So it pays for itself pretty quickly. So yeah, for Blueberry, I believe it's Robson Valley Adventure. If not, there's another company that will be offering it. It's on the Facebook page. I just can't think of it off the top of my head right now. Alrighty. And does anybody else have any other questions? There was one other alt I forgot to talk about tonight. This is the Coral Pass alternate at the end of section B, kind of right as you come into Kananaskis. It's a spectacularly beautiful alternate. There is a stout river crossing, depending on the year, to access it. So if you are wanting to do the Coral Pass alternate, you can definitely plan for it, but be prepared to maybe change those plans when you see the river. When I was going across it, this would have been the second week of July. It was like way deeper than 6 feet deep and quite rapid. We briefly talked about inflating our sleeping pads and swimming across, but it was quickly like, this is not the right choice, like at all. So yeah, just it's definitely worth it for an alternate, but definitely keep an open mind on whether it's accessible. All right, we'll give people another minute if there's any other questions. All right, I don't see any. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thanks a bunch, Josh, for coming. This is super informative and helpful. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for everybody for supporting the Great Divide Trail Association. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them on the Hikers Facebook page. I do my best to get to them as quickly as possible. And if I don't know, there's probably somebody that does know. We are hopefully back next Thursday with a trip planning, more about itinerary-based questions. I know a lot of people have questions on how to plan out an itinerary. There's some good resources on the website, and we're working really hard to hopefully get somebody from Parks Canada onto our webinar to talk about the new booking system, because it'll be new for all of us. If we can't, I can still talk a lot about how to plan out an itinerary and some strategies that have worked for the past booking system. So keep your eyes on the social media channels, and hopefully we'll see most of you next week. Thanks, everyone.